The year is 2024 AD. Western culture lies in ruins. For almost a decade, a great Hollywoodian jihad against all that was good and pure in the world of entertainment has raged. The great franchises have all been wiped out. The franchises minor have been hunted down almost to the point of extinction. Total demoralization has set in among the movie-going public. The Geeks Red has for years been in open rebellion against the Hollywood imperium. It is a time of loss and sorrow. Decades before, a prophet, whom the people called Frank Herbert, had foretold that from among this wasteland of grief and depravity would arise a savior, one who would bring hope in a time when all hope had been abandoned. Now, the savior has come. Its name, Dune.
Dune Part Two is excellent. It is the cinematic vision that finally delivered on the promise of Frank Herbert's masterpiece, published almost 60 years ago. And while the movie does have problems with adaptation and runtime, its thematic, symbolic, and visual depth goes beyond almost all contemporary cinema. Dune Part 2 is the best major Hollywood production in years. One of the most important points of praise I can lavish upon Dune is that Denis Villeneuve understands the source material on a thematic level, and that understanding forms the creative framework of his movie. Villeneuve does not make the mistake of treating Dune like a hero's journey. Quite the opposite. The story of Paul Atreides is a tragedy and a cautionary tale. Frank Herbert himself was explicit about this.
I was almost a historian. I've seriously considered being a historian, and while I was in the throes of this decision, I came on the idea that leaders amplify the mistakes. Their mistakes are amplified by the numbers who follow them without question. And charismatic leaders tend to build up followings, power structures, and those power structures tend to be taken over by people who are corruptible. I don't think that the old saw about power corrupting and absolute power corrupting absolutely is accurate. I think power attracts the corruptible.
The first aspect of Dune Part 2 we'll examine in detail is the adaptation from the book. Most of the negative criticism this movie has thus far generated comes from Dune fans who are unhappy with aspects of the adaptation, particularly the role of Chani, which we'll get to in time. The biggest change from the book, and in my opinion the biggest single problem with the adaptation and indeed the movie, is time contraction. The book covers around 4 years. Paul leaves Caladan at the age of 15 and ascends to the Imperial throne at 19. He spends over 2 years with the Fremen on Arrakis. In Villeneuve's Dune, the entire story takes place in under 1 year. That is, the Atreides take over Arrakis, they are defeated, Paul flees into the desert and is accepted by the Fremen. His mother becomes the Reverend Mother of the Fremen. Paul trains with the Fremen and learns the ways of the desert. He becomes a leading figure in the war against the Harkonnen occupation. His victories against the Harkonnens force them to replace Rabban as governor of Arrakis. He becomes a rider of Shai Hulud. He takes the Water of Life and becomes the Kwisatz Haderach, is accepted as the Lisan al-Gaib of the Fremen, unites the Fremen tribes into a single political entity, attains total political and military control over that entity, explodes a nuke, destroys the Harkonnens, defeats the Imperial force brought by the Emperor to restore control of Arrakis, kills Feyd-Rautha, brings the Emperor to heel, ascends the Imperial throne, and he falls in love and starts a relationship with the best bit of gear this side of Sietch Tabor. Alright, second best, let's be real here, son. Chani's friend is hotter. My mind is beginning to conjure visions, an infinite variety of possibilities and positions. I can see them all, and then all of them I can barely walk afterward. Everything that happens over the course of both movies, from when Paul enters the desert as a fugitive to his imperial ascent, occurs in just under 8 months. Since Jessica was several weeks pregnant when she entered the desert with Paul and has not given birth by the end of the movie. Plainly spoken, that's absurd. Verisimilitude is integral to Dune. Frank Herbert understood that even a people prepped by the Bene Gesserit to believe in the prophecy of a Messiah will take time to win over. It also takes time to train an army for open war, to wage a guerrilla campaign, to set up an intelligence network, to consolidate political power, and establish an effective military and political command structure, all of which will have to come after Paul and his mother integrate into the Fremen. Villeneuve's time contraction strains believability almost to breaking point. It also has other consequences. Having the Harkonnens go from the apex of power to total defeat in the space of 8 months diminishes them. It makes them appear less the powerful, ruthless empire that they are, and more a gangster tin pot regime. Villeneuve went with the timeline contraction because he wanted a more streamlined story, and clearly because he didn't want to depict Alia as a 2-year-old baby with the mind of an adult and the powers of a reverent mother, choosing instead to depict her as a talking fetus, which is actually lore accurate. And this is understandable. When David Lynch cast Alia in June 1984, he had to age the character up. Her age isn't mentioned, but she's clearly older than 2, and she's played by a 7-year-old actress who did a great job.
Poor Emperor. I'm afraid my brother won't be very pleased with you.
Silence!
I was disappointed not to see toddler genius Alia in the movie. At the age of 2, she is captured while leading a Fremen attack group against the Sardaukar. That was absolutely something that I needed to see, and I still need to see it. Alia maintains that she allowed herself to be captured because she didn't want to face Paul and explain to him that his son was killed in the battle. One of my favourite parts of the book is when the Emperor is berating Baron Harkonnen. Alia speaks to the Emperor in mocking familiarity while also demeaning the Baron. Quote,
"Make him afraid some more, Shaddam. I shouldn't enjoy this, but I find the pleasure impossible to suppress."
Shortly thereafter, she kills the Baron, then apologizes for having to kill him and runs off to kill wounded enemy soldiers like a good Fremen child. Just spectacular stuff. This would have been wonderful to see in the Villeneuve adaptation. And before we continue, let's just take a moment to admire this shot of Alia on the battlefield of Arrakeen, knife in hand. June 1984 has its problems, but that one shot alone is magic. In order to depict Alia accurately, Villeneuve would have had to use a very tiny 5 or 6-year-old girl. Any younger would be too young, unless you're Vladimir Harkonnen or Stephen Hawking. It would have been very difficult to get a 5-year-old actress to convincingly deliver a line like,
"He doesn't appear much, does he? One frightened old fat man too weak to support his own flesh without the help of suspensors."
But it could have been done. If Dune Part 2 started as Book 3 of the Dune novel does, 2 years after the defeat of Duke Leto, it would have had to include exposition to explain that a war has raged between the Fremen and the Harkonnens during that time, that Alia was born and has the mental faculties of an adult genius, and that Paul and Chani are de facto married and they have an infant son. "Chani, my love, my wife in all but name of the previous 2 years, how is our 2-year-old son Leto?" "Alia the Strange, your sister, refused to play with him again. This must be because she was transformed in your mother's womb by the water of life. She is a reverent mother in the body of an infant. It saddens me that we are not married, my love, but I understand that you must remain available for political reasons. How goes the war against the Harkonnens? We have fought them for 2 years and forced them to confine themselves to urban areas. That's good." But with good writing, this information could easily be communicated naturally over the course of the first act, or with a prologue, similar to the first movie.
My planet Arrakis is so beautiful when the sun is low. At nightfall, the spice harvester's land.
Another problem with time contraction is that it creates plot holes. In the novel, Paul and his mother train the Fremen in modern war and martial combat. This is why the Fremen are able to finally defeat the Harkonnens. In Dune Part 2, Paul simply joins a war the Fremen are already engaged in against the Harkonnens, and at first is just one more soldier in a war which starts going spectacularly well for the Fremen for reasons that are not explained. The morale boost the Fremen soldiers get from the legend of Muad'Dib would help a little, but this does not explain the sudden, massive improvement in their tactics and strategy. How were the Fremen, who suffered under Harkonnen oppression for 80 years, suddenly able to turn the war around and win over the course of 8 months without any training from Paul and his Bene Bene Gesserit mother. The last and worst effect that timeline contraction has on the story is that it diminishes Paul as a character. In the novel, Paul earns his place as the leader of the Fremen because he trains them and leads them in battle, which brings them victory, liberation, and conquest. It is this leadership combined with his fulfillment of the prophecy that he is the Lisan al-Gaib, which binds him to the Fremen as their messiah. He is also a father, which raises the stakes of his fight. He is fighting for power, conquest, and vengeance. All just causes, to be sure, but he's also fighting for his son, Leto II. Paul must win this war so that his son can grow up in security. From the perspective of the audience, this is his most relatable reason for fighting. The most tragic moment of the book is when Paul learns of his son's death. It is a very important element in the story which emphasizes that Paul's story is not a hero's journey. It is a tragedy. It is the dark inversion of the hero's journey told within the traditional framework of the hero's journey.
I worked to create a leader in this book who would be really an attractive, charismatic person for all the good reasons, not for any bad reasons. Then power comes to him. He makes decisions. Some of his decisions made for millions of people, millions upon millions of people, don't work out too well.
In the book, Gurney threatens to kill Jessica because he has been convinced by Harkonnen propaganda that Jessica was the traitor that brought down House Atreides. Paul never foresaw Gurney's attack on his mother in his visions, and after the incident is resolved, Paul realizes that his powers of prescience are insufficient to protect his family, and so he drinks the water of life. He succeeds in attaining the power of a Kwisatz Haderach, but ironically he becomes so focused on destroying his enemies and gaining more power that he neglects to ensure his family are properly protected, leading to the death of his son. The death of Paul's son also raises an interesting question. Is he the true Kwisatz Haderach, or is he an abomination, a proto-Kwisatz Haderach that just happened to gain power? Is he the true Messiah, or just the guy who won? Just as with Gurney's attack on his mother, Paul's prescience never alerted him to the possibility that his son would be killed, and in his arrogance and carelessness, he didn't move his son to a secret location or garrison the CH his son was killed in because it was far to the south. Leto II was heir to Arrakis, and should Paul win the Battle of Arrakeen, heir to the Imperial throne. This is shockingly poor work from Paul, abysmal incompetence, and his son pays the price. Would the true Kwisatz Haderach have made such a woeful blunder? Finally, the death of Paul's son infuses catharsis in Paul's final victory. The death of the Baron and the defeat of the Emperor are all the more satisfying and cathartic because these men are the murderers of Paul's infant son and many other children besides. The death of the Baron coming at the hands of Alia, a child, is particularly just because the Baron has committed horrifying sexual abuse against children. All of this is extremely important to the Dune story, and all of it is lost in the timeline contraction. Villeneuve has traded it all in for a more streamlined story, and it's a bad trade-off. The timeline in the Dune novel was perfect. The one used in the movies is heavily flawed. Villeneuve has taken something perfect and made it imperfect. In terms of story, the three big changes are the roles played by Feyd-Rautha, Chani, and Alia the Strange, Jessica's daughter. In the book, Feyd-Rautha appears in only a few scenes and does not arrive on Arrakis until the last chapter. He never rules on Arrakis. He's also involved in two complex plots. The first is a sham fight against a slave gladiator in the arena. The second is a plot to kill his uncle, Baron Harkonnen. For the sham fight, Feyd has arranged with Feyd-Rautha, Duke Leto's former mentat who now works for Baron Harkonnen, to make it look like an attempt has been made on Feyd's life. The ostensible plot that the onlooking public is intended to perceive is that an undrugged slave gladiator has been sent against Feyd to assassinate him, but Feyd, through skill and heroism, heroically overcomes this villainous conspiracy. In reality, Feyd-Rautha has implanted a code word inside the subconscious of the slave gladiator. Upon hearing the word scum, the slave's muscles will freeze. Feyd also secretly placed poison on his black blade instead of his white blade, which rules dictate is supposed to carry the poison. Feyd utilizes both cheat codes in the fight and kills the slave gladiator, then insists the gladiator who fought well be left bodily intact and given an honorable burial, further endearing him to the mob. The Baron is unaware of all this and initially thinks that a plot has indeed been hatched to kill Feyd. Feyd's goal is to win popularity among the populace, increase his political capital, and make the Baron look incompetent. The Baron is forced to scapegoat and execute his own slave master, despite his growing suspicion that the fight was a sham, a suspicion later confirmed to him by Feyd himself. This is a brilliant bit of storytelling. The conspiracy itself is a riveting piece of dramatic intrigue, but it's also important in communicating the ruthless Byzantine nature of internal Harkonnen politics and the sadism, cunning, evil, and gambler nature of Feyd-Rautha. The movie does include the gladiator arena fight, but significantly simplifies it for the sake of brevity. In the movie, the slave is sent against Feyd, undrugged, on the orders of the Baron, who wants to improve Feyd's popularity and build his legend before he is put in charge of Arrakis. The sham fight could easily have been adopted on screen, as was written in the book. For example, an obsequious slave approaches Feyd just as he's about to enter the arena, and we get something like,
"My lord and Baron, a message from the Baron's mentat.
Speak."
The word is scum.
Feyd smiles and nods, then kills the messenger slave and enters the arena. When Feyd is in danger in the fight, he shouts, "Scum!" His opponent is noticeably paralyzed, and Feyd kills him. Feyd-Rautha smiles as he looks down on this from the Baron's box. Later, the details of the plot are revealed to the movie audience when Feyd admits to the Baron that the fight was a sham. It's great stuff, but unfortunately, Villeneuve doesn't render an adaptation this pure because, presumably, he doesn't want to delve into the complex inner workings of Harkonnen politics. And in any case, he doesn't have the runtime. A major release, almost $200 million movie, must make a massive amount of money at the box office. The shorter a movie is, the more showings can be packed into a weekend, and normies are less likely to show up for extremely long movies. As is, Dune Part 2 is 2 hours and 35 minutes long. The inclusion of Feyd-Rautha would require at least 15 more minutes of screen time. The audience would need to know why Duke Leto's mentat from the last movie is now working for Baron Harkonnen. His presence would need to be justified with some scenes in which he and the Baron discuss strategy. His death scene would need to be included, and it would need to be explained that the Baron has poisoned Hawat, secretly administers the antidote in Hawat's food, and that Hawat will die after a few days without the antidote. It would also need to be explained that Hawat was loyal to the Atreides all along, and was playing the long game that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the Harkonnens. Hawat would also need to be given a role on Arrakis that isn't in the books, since the Baron, like Feyd-Rautha, does not return to Arrakis following the fall of Duke Leto until the end of the novel. Doing all this would push the movie close to 3 hours. Warner would never have allowed an additional 15 to 20 minutes of screen time, and if the 15 minutes, and that is a very conservative estimate, required to portray Hawat came at the expense of existing scenes, the movie would feel rushed, which was a major problem in Dune Part 1. In fact, Villeneuve had filmed scenes with Count Fenring, an important character who refuses to kill Paul at the end of the book, but was forced to cut them out to get the movie down to the theatre-friendly length that Warner insisted on. Feyd-Rautha's aforementioned plot to kill his uncle, the Baron Harkonnen, was a scene I was sad not to see in the movie. In the book, Feyd has the slave handlers place a poison needle inside the thigh of one of the Baron's catamites, the hope being that the Baron will be pricked by the needle while caressing that part of the boy's anatomy. Unfortunately, this plot doesn't work. The Baron sees a blemish left on the slave boy's thigh by the insertion of the needle, orders the slave master and several guards garroted, then summons Feyd and makes a deal with him. Feyd will not make any more attempts on the Baron's life, and in exchange, the Baron will conspire to seat Feyd upon the Imperial throne, a process he has already begun by that stage of the book. Then the Baron makes Feyd kill every girl in the slave quarters with his own hands, girls that Feyd is very fond of. Feyd is extremely unhappy about this and secretly vows revenge. The Baron's plot to enthrone Feyd does make it into the movie, but the assassination attempt against the Baron does not. This is a shame. The scene would have worked very well as a standalone set piece and improved the characterization of Feyd-Rautha, who is depicted supremely by Austin Butler, and it would have communicated the utter depravity of the Harkonnen body politic. The scene would also have given us more Baron Harkonnen, who is sidelined in favour of Feyd-Rautha as antagonist, a creative divergence from the book which I actually approve of, but more on that later. Finally, including the attempt on the Baron's life would have shown that the Baron is a pedo. who likes to do things to young boys that leaves their arsehole looking like a Dune popcorn bucket. Showing the full extent of the Baron's crimes, including the atrocities he commits against children, would have made his death more cathartic, and thus better. Of course, none of this can be included because it would imperil Dune's PG-13 rating and get the movie banned in many countries, and this movie needs to make at least $700 million. Dune isn't Game of Thrones, an adult-rated TV show featuring men walking around with their flaccid cocks swinging joyfully in the wind. This is a PG-13 sci-fi movie that needs an international release. Therefore, no catamites. A loss to be sure, but an inevitable one. Probably the most noticeable change made from the book is the use of Feyd-Rautha as the main antagonist. The underutilization of Feyd-Rautha is, in my mortal opinion, the single biggest flaw in the Dune novel. I am a huge fan of Dune. I have read the first 4 of the 6 Frank Herbert books and gave up on the 5th. I count myself among the pro-God Emperor faction of the fanbase. There are many Dune fans who hate that book, and I will concede that if a giant man-worm expositing his political philosophy over the course of several hundred pages isn't your idea of a good time, you won't like God Emperor of Dune. However, I, Baron Despot of House Despot and Ruler Supreme of Antrim Prime, regard a book about a tyrannical god emperor who rules over a vast galactic empire for 3,500 years to be not only compelling, but inspiring. But as much of a Dune stan as I am, Dune isn't perfect. Frank Herbert's build-up of the Feyd-Rautha plot was brilliant. The Baron would allow Beast Rabban free reign as governor of Arrakis with a mandate to brutalize the population and maximize spice production at any and all costs. The population would grow to hate him, and then Feyd-Rautha would be sent in to topple the evil Beast Rabban and be welcomed as a savior by the grateful population. The problem is, this never happened. Rabban was never able to pacify Arrakis, and so Feyd-Rautha was never sent in. A better story would have been what Villeneuve does in the movie. Feyd-Rautha is sent in not to play the part of the Liberator as a stepping stone to the Imperial throne, but simply to win a war that has been horribly mismanaged by Beast Rabban. Feyd is, after all, the product of a Bene Gesserit breeding program, and extremely formidable not just in training but in sheer genetic superiority and natural talent. Feyd-Rautha makes sense as the monstrous villain that Paul must overcome in his own ascent to power, not just in the final duel but on the battlefield. Denis Villeneuve gives the audience that villain, and performed by Austin Butler, he is an absolute force of nature. The changes made to Chani's character are the most controversial among the book fans, and their criticism is understandable. In the book, Chani is Paul's concubine and mother to his first son, Leto II. She is also largely apolitical, not concerning herself with the socio-political or religious implications of Paul's ascent to power. In the movie, none of this is the case. She does become Paul's lover, but does not bear him children. She has a much more active role in the Fremen War against the Harkonnens, and in the movie's single biggest character divergence from the book, she is opposed to Paul's rise as the Lisan al-Gaib, the Messiah of the Fremen. She believes that the Messiah prophecy Paul seems to be fulfilling is nothing more than Bene Gesserit social engineering spread among the population so that they could be more easily exploited by the Bene Gesserit if the need ever arose. We live in a cultural environment in which fans have seen their on-screen male heroes turned into pathetic morons or just outright killed off, so that the now very much former hero's place can be taken by a strong, powerful, stunning, brave, and vastly more capable
female counterpart.
For a solid decade, the trope of the girl boss taking the incompetent former hero's place has been trotted out in front of audiences literally dozens of times across many franchises as part of Hollywood's own social engineering program, which fortunately has proven considerably less successful than the programs of the Bene Gesserit. It is completely understandable that fans would react aggressively after seeing that Chani had seemingly been turned into a girl boss, but the changes made to Chani are done for legitimate reasons and do not constitute an update for a modern audience or a mutilation of the character. Much of the narrative of the Dune novel occurs within the minds of the characters. Frank Herbert constantly communicates what the characters are thinking. Often he describes what characters think other characters are thinking, and what characters think other characters think they think they're thinking.
I know what you're thinking.
I know that you know what I'm thinking.
I know that you know that I know what you're thinking.
I know that you know that I know that you know what I'm thinking.
While this works in a literary format, it is extremely difficult to do compelling in audiovisual media. Here is an example of it done quite poorly in June 1984.
He's more concerned over his men than the spice. I must admit, against all better judgment, I like this Duke.
By the way, I will be referring to that movie as June 1984 and not as Lynch's Dune, out of respect for David Lynch, who disowned the movie long ago, saying the following on the subject.
Dune, I didn't have final cut on. On Dune, I started selling out even in the script phase, so it was a slow dying the death and a terrible experience.
Do you regret making it?
Yes.
I mean, there's been talk for years about your version of it, which does not exist.
No, it doesn't exist. There is no other version. There's more stuff, but even that is putrefied.
In June 1984, the internal dialogue doesn't work because it creates narrative perspective clashes. In the novel, the narrative perspective is that of the storyteller, Frank Herbert, who is writing in the third person. He can thus communicate what everyone is thinking. Internal dialogue can work in a movie when it matches the narrative perspective. Here's it done correctly in Goodfellas.
That's when I knew I would never have come back from Florida alive.
This works because the entire movie is told from the perspective of Henry in the first person. It doesn't work in June 1984 because every time an internal dialogue is voiced, the narrative perspective shifts from outworld neutral third person perspective to in-world first person perspective, which is emotionally jarring and logically incoherent. Villeneuve obviously did not want to repeat the mistakes of June 1984, but he needed to communicate Paul's internal struggle with what is referred to in the book as his terrible purpose. Paul is aware that he is regarded as the Lisan al-Gaib by the Fremen, and that he could be the Kwisatz Haderach, a super being who will be the end result of a centuries-long Bene Gesserit breeding program. The spice gives him prescient visions of the future in which he sees himself leading a great jihad in which billions are killed. Paul's thoughts about the dangers of the Fremen's fanatical belief in him are a constant in the book, but Villeneuve can't just dump a jarring think track into the movie, and Dune Part Two not having been written by the authors of Morbius and Madam Web, we are unlikely to get scenes such as this. Chani, my lover of 2 years, wake up. I've never told you this before during our 2 years together, but I've been thinking about how my position as the Messiah of the Fremen may lead to a genocide. If the prophecy is true and the Fremen become the fanatical warriors I need to return Arrakis to Atreides' rule, then they will become the spearhead of a great jihad that even I will be powerless to stop. But if the prophecy is false, I and my family will perish. The Fremen will become powerless. The Harkonnen will annihilate the Fremen population of the planet, and a dark age of Harkonnen rule will envelop the galaxy as they ascend to imperial power. I find myself the focal point at the nexus of disaster, humanity facing enslavement and torture in one possible future, and the merciless fires of the jihad in the other. I am the fulcrum. Well, that's a buzzkill. By the way, did I ever tell you that the spice gives me prescient visions in which I glimpse many possible futures for humanity? No, you never mentioned that. Well, it does. Paul's internal struggle with his position as a messianic leader is communicated partly through his brief visions of the jihad, but mostly through Chani. She speaks out loud the thoughts that Paul has in his head in the books, and communicates his doubts about the prophecy itself and his position as the Lisan al-Gaib. Chani also has another function in the movie, which is extremely important on a thematic and symbolic level. She represents Paul's link to humanity. She is his woman, his lover, his closest friend. She keeps him in touch with the deep feelings of love and warmth that motivated him to see the Fremen free from Harkonnen oppression and avenge his late father. As his power grows, and especially after he takes the Water of Life and awakens as the Kwisatz Haderach, a figure of immense power, Paul increasingly loses touch with his basic humanity. Near the end of the book, after his ascent to total power, Paul even proclaims, "There are no innocents anymore." Unfortunately, this line wasn't included in the movie. In the book, Paul's infant son is killed by the Sardaukar in a surprise raid far to the south, while Paul is in the north, about to launch his final attack against the combined might of the Emperor and the Harkonnens. The death of Paul's son represents the severing of his connection with humanity at an emotional level, the end of Paul as a common man, albeit a powerful one. At that point, all that is left is the leader, who will become a conqueror, who will become an emperor, who will become a tyrant. In the movie, Paul takes on an increasingly dark and power-hungry tone as the story approaches its climax. Paul turns to Chani and says,
"I will love you as long as I breathe,"
and immediately thereafter demands the Emperor's daughter as his bride. Chani is, understandably, not too happy about this and takes off in a huff. But don't worry, Paul's son, she'll be back. Treat her mean, keep her keen. Am I right, boys? Chani leaving Paul at the end of the movie serves the same function as Paul's son's murder does in the book. It symbolizes the severing of Paul's connection with common humanity. He is no longer among them, he is above them now, and he will reign over them with a genocidal brutality unknown in the history of the galaxy. In Paul's own words, "You will think back to the gentle ways of the Sardaukar." In the next book, Dune Messiah, we learn that the tyrant emperor Paul Atreides unleashed a jihad that resulted in the deaths of 61 billion people, which included the complete depopulation or sterilization of 90 planets. It's also worth mentioning that Frank Herbert considered the first 3 Dune books to be a single book, a book which was, above all, about the dangers of following charismatic leaders and how power structures grow beyond the control of those leaders. The omission of Paul and Chani's son in Dune Part Two and the changes made to Chani's character were not motivated by the narcissistic activism of ideologically possessed sadists determined to tear female characters away from any role that could be considered even remotely feminine, as has been the case in almost every major production released by Hollywood over the past 10 years. The changes were made for mostly narrative and thematic purposes. Villeneuve also wanted to give Chani a bigger role in the movie. Speaking in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, Villeneuve said,
"In the second part of the book, Chani and Lady Jessica are a bit more in the background, which I didn't like, because I am absolutely in love with both characters. I felt it was more meaningful to give them more substance and presence, their own agendas."
And the idea that Chani has been turned into a girl boss when in the book she was a harmless domestic is simply wrong. There is a scene in the book in which a Fremen man arrives at Paul's home to challenge him to single combat, and Chani, without even notifying Paul, kills the man herself. Paul strongly objects to this, but Chani defends her slaying of the challenger on the basis that if he couldn't beat her, he had no business challenging Muad'Dib, and word will get out that Muad'Dib is so powerful that Fremen warriors can't even defeat his woman, who he trained himself. Chani asserts that the result of her killing the challenger will be that less men come to challenge Paul and end up dead as a result, a prediction which proves correct. Calling Chani a girl boss also demonstrates a misunderstanding of what a girl boss is. The modern girl boss trope is a nominally female character who possesses immense physical fighting prowess for no discernible reason other than the writers wanted to portray a strong female character. Examples include Rey Palpatine, remade Mulan, Mini Jovovich from Lar 17, Guy Ladriel from Rings of Power, and more recently Bryce Dallas Howard from Argyle and Echo from Echo. Note also that all of those non-characters are sexless freaks who have been severed utterly from female sexuality. They are essentially psychotic, asexual male characters played by women. Chani is a good fighter because she is a Fremen, who are all formidable fighters, and because she has been trained by Paul. Though the timeline contraction does create a character plot hole for Chani, she's a good warrior, but how is she this good even though she hasn't been trained by Paul? Though this problem is not unique to Chani, she shares it with every other Fremen warrior. Chani is also sexually very feminine in the movie. She is initially enamored with Paul because of his fighting abilities and gets wetter than Caladan when she sees him riding Shai Hulud. Perhaps Paul riding a giant phallic object is a foreshadowing of what Chani is going to do when she gets Paul alone in a still tent.
Call me by your name, Timothy!
Zendaya was also very good. Some have accused her of a one-note performance, but this is just wrong. Chani goes through a very wide range of emotions in the movie, and Zendaya communicates them all effectively. At the end of the movie, she captures perfectly the utter heartbreak that Chani feels when Paul is engaged to Princess Irulan. I really felt for Chani at the end of the movie, and it was because of Zendaya's performance. Some idiots have suggested that this breaks canon because Chani was okay with it, bro. She knew Paul had to marry the princess for political reasons. Of course she did, but that doesn't mean she liked it. She was fucking devastated. She just watched some random man-stealing space bitch arrive at the 11th hour to marry her guy. And yeah, Paul said he was going to keep it legit with Chani, but Florence Pugh is gear. Paul may be able to become Emperor of the Galaxy through sheer force of will, but a man's willpower has limits. The end of the movie does not diverge from Herbert's novel. It is a tribute to the novel. The book ends with Jessica and Chani, Jessica telling her that they lived as concubines, but they will be remembered as wives. The movie ends with a shot of Jessica, then Chani, who, as in the book, is shattered by the thought that she will never be the wife of the man she loves. Fucking based.
I love it.
The movie also ends on an imperfect cadence, just as the book does.
Herbert's book ends rather abruptly, you know, and you kind of buy into that and do it the same way.
I love it.
Was that always like...
In order to bring this idea home, that thing that becomes out of control and that betrayal and that tragedy, I had to finish there. And that I was like adamant, I was like 100% certain that it was the best way. I love movies that end like that, like in a strong statement.
Just as Chani serves as a conduit for Paul's thoughts, Alia remains a sentient fetus in the womb throughout the movie for the same reason. Jessica has internal conversations with Alia, which allows the audience to get a better understanding of what Jessica is thinking. This is similar to the cheesy internal monologues of June 1984, but it works because it's a conversation between two characters rather than internal thoughts voiced out loud in a sudden, jarring interruption of the narrative. Fetus Alia also captures the ethereal mysticism of Alia. It may not be as fun and entertaining as a 2-year-old killing a giant fat man with a gom jabbar, then running off to stab wounded soldiers to death, but Fetus Alia does communicate the profound otherness of Alia as a character and the intense mysticism that surrounds her. Before I move on to the minor changes made from the novel, let it be here known that I, the Despot, writing on March 2nd of the year 2024 AD, predict a box office total for Dune of $752 million. Already, my prescience brought forth visions of futures which have come to pass. 10 months ago, in my Queen Cleopatra video, I prophesied the abominations of the Google Gemini AI.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
I foretold the box office failures of Aquaman 2, Lar 18 and Indy 5, the success of Wonka, and, unique among YouTube film geeks, I foresaw the box office calamity that was the Marvels, and as I gaze into the endless possible futures of humanity, in all of them I see a despot triumphant, rising to take his rightful place upon a throne carved of my enemies' skulls.
Our flag will wave victorious over the smouldering ruins of our enemies' strongholds. Their leaders will suffer in agony as they cry out for death. Their children will be cast into the fires of the jihad. Entire nations will be sterilized until desiccated and barren. There are no innocents anymore. There is only the jihad of the glorious Despot.
This seems as good a time as any in this video to share a review of Dune Part 2 I came across in my research for the video. This is an absolute gem, which, were I not to share with you, would be a dereliction of my duty as Baron Despot of House Despot and ruler supreme of Antrim Prime, from Armand White of the National Review.
It's all fatuous, like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films. Nothing in Villeneuve's Dune series is as good as Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon, which revives mythic understanding of both mankind's history and fate.
I have no comment on his assertions, but I do love the very try-hard attempt to appear erudite.
The Keystone Cops were black and white comedy. Rodney King was white on black crimedy.
laughter as the Kalashnikov of the pacifist terrorist.
It's all fatuous, like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films. Nothing in Villeneuve's Dune series is as good as Zack Snyder's Rebel Moon, which revives mythic understanding of both mankind's history and fate.
Do forgive me, but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation, and I do feel it would be remiss of me not to smash you in the face with a cricket bat.
The noticeable minor changes from the book are as follows. In the book, the Emperor is described as a man of 72 who looked no older than 35. In the movie, the Emperor is played by Christopher Walken, who is 80. Villeneuve probably chose to depict Shaddam as old both in age and physique to avoid confusing the audience, and to create a strong visual contrast between the old, weak Emperor Shaddam and the young, powerful Paul Atreides. Villeneuve is very fond of visual contrast, and he does a lot of it in this movie. There is no geographical religious divide among the Fremen in the book, but there are plenty of Fremen who don't believe Paul is the Lisan al-Gaib. These include the Challenger killed by Chani and many other Challengers who Paul slew prior. Paul does not threaten to nuke the spice fields. There are no permanent spice fields. Spice is formed naturally as part of the worm trout hatching process. In the book, Paul threatens to wipe out the worms by creating a water of death, which, when poured onto a pre-spice mass, will cause a chain reaction that will ultimately kill all the worms. Explaining how all of this works in the movie would take too long, so Villeneuve simply has Paul threaten to nuke his own planet to destroy the spice. It's a good decision and saves time, but this omission does leave out some important religious lore. Paul's threat to wipe out Shai-Hulud, the worms, horrifies the Fremen, who regard Shai-Hulud as sacred. The most important minor change is the death of Rabban. In the novel, Beast Rabban is killed during the Battle of Arrakeen. It is not mentioned how he is killed, and his death does not occur within the narrative of the book. Paul is told afterward that Rabban died in the battle, but his death is not described. In the movie, Rabban is killed by Gurney Halleck. This is a just and cathartic moment, as Rabban had viciously beaten Gurney Halleck when he was a slave on Gedi Prime and killed Gurney's entire family. Gurney's killing of Rabban is not just an act of war, it is an act of personal vengeance. It's a shame Gurney isn't given his revenge in the book, and it's nice to see it in the movie. Gurney also gets to deliver the satisfying line, "This is for my Duke and my friends." There is a very good reason this dramatic beat is absent in the book. Frank Herbert was going for in-world realism, and in the midst of a battle involving tens of thousands of soldiers occurring during a massive sandstorm, it is vanishingly unlikely that Gurney would have come face to face with Rabban, and the Fremen didn't take prisoners during the battle. Villeneuve adds a symbolic flourish to Gurney killing Rabban. Rabban attacks Gurney with a whip, the same weapon he had lashed Gurney with when he was a slave master on Gedi Prime. Gurney rolls the whip and kills Rabban. This exchange is a symbolic microcosm of Gurney's personal journey from slave to conqueror of the Harkonnens. If I could round Dune Part 2 up to 3 hours, I would include 2 additional scenes: the sham fight build-up and Feyd-Rautha's assassination attempt against the Baron, which would end with Feyd-Rautha standing among the slave girls and pulling out a blade. Then the camera cuts to the Baron as we hear the slaughter for a few seconds. Austin Butler and Stellan Skarsgård were both excellent. They absolutely nailed the characters, and the movie needed more of them. A long scene of them together would have been magic. Dune Part 2's timeline contraction creates plot holes and presents an incomplete version of Paul Atreides, but thematically and in terms of overall story, the movie is a faithful adaptation of the book, and nothing in it, even the timeline contraction, is anywhere near as bad as the now infamously bungled depiction of Kynes in Dune Part 1. But, importantly, Denis Villeneuve learned the lessons of the Kynes debacle, and Dune Part 2 did not include any DEI or ESG motivated character mutilations. Most importantly, the central themes of Dune, the dangers of a charismatic leader, the question of religion as a tool of propaganda and political control, and the inevitability of powerful political structures becoming corrupt are central to the movie. Paul is not a hero in Dune Part 2, he is the hero who lives long enough to see himself become the villain. Despite the poor decision to contract the timeline, the heart of Dune beats at the core of Villeneuve's movie. The main takeaway from Dune Part 2 as an adaptation is that faithfulness to the source material works, and that a production strays away from source material at its own peril, and, more often than not, to its own detriment. As it turns out, story, characters, and ideas that have been read and acclaimed by tens of millions of readers for decades are better than turgid shit churned out in writers' rooms by faceless hacks more focused on impressing each other with their fashionable takes and message-driven script inserts than on creating a piece of entertainment that viewers will actually enjoy. The most obviously impressive aspect of Villeneuve's direction is the visuals. He uses a lot of visual contrast and symbolism to communicate important elements of the story, such as the moral depravity of the Harkonnens or the immeasurable value and rarity of water on Arrakis. In Dune Part 1, Caladan is shown to be a very water-rich planet, a contrast to Arrakis which emphasizes just how utterly barren Arrakis is. In this shot, a troop carrier emerges from the Sea of Arrakis with water pouring off it. Later, a companion shot shows a troop carrier, possibly the same ship, landing on Arrakis. In both scenes, the ship hovers over an ocean. On Caladan, an ocean of water. On Arrakis, an ocean of sand. These kinds of visual couplets are used frequently over the course of the two movies. In Dune Part 2, Feyd-Rautha kills an aide, then forces Rabban to kiss his feet, cementing his position as leader of Arrakis by force of will. At the end of the movie, the exact same dramatic beats are repeated. Paul kills Feyd-Rautha, then forces the Emperor to kiss his ring, cementing his position as Emperor by force of will. Here, Villeneuve suggests a moral equivalence between the tyrant governor Feyd-Rautha and the tyrant Emperor Paul Atreides. An example of visual contrast is the cinematography used to depict the Gedi Prime gladiator fight sequence. Villeneuve says of this sequence,
"I wanted their world to feel binary, fascist, insectoid, without nuances."
The distinct look of Gedi Prime was achieved by mixing monochrome with color photography. Monochrome photography uses different shades of a single color or hue. For example, this photo is monochrome red, and this one is monochrome yellow. Depicting Gedi Prime in a style that is cinematographically distinct from the rest of the movie was a bold move, rather than the tired Hollywood trope of lazily throwing a filter, often a yellow filter, over scenes happening in not America. Villeneuve actually does something thoughtful, aggressive, and interesting. This is exactly the kind of innovation that is needed in major productions today. Hollywood is currently neck deep in a quagmire of trope-laden shit of its own defecation, and this refusal to innovate was a major contributing factor that led to the flopbuster disasters of 2023. Audiences are sick of seeing the same shite again and again and again. It's no coincidence that Oppenheimer and Barbie, both massive successes, were visually innovative. Villeneuve makes use of unfacing in his depiction of the Harkonnens and the Sardaukar. I discussed this technique in my Women Talking video. It's when the villains' faces are not shown in order to dehumanize them and portray them more easily as a manifestation of evil. Some examples I didn't mention in my Women Talking video are the prison guards at the start of The Running Man, who all wear visor helmets, regime guards in Equilibrium, who also wear visor helmets, and Jason Voorhees, who wears a mask. In Dune, the Sardaukar are almost always wearing visor helmets. Use of unfacing in the depiction of the Harkonnens is more subtle. All hair has been shaved from their heads, including eyebrows. This makes them less expressive and vaguely alien looking. Steven Spielberg did something similar with the German soldiers in Saving Private Ryan, who were all thuggish looking men with shaved heads in their late 30s or older. Have a look at Feyd-Rautha as depicted by Sting. He looks like someone who knows how to have a good time, a guy you wouldn't mind sitting down with to have a drink or seven. Compare this with Austin Butler's Feyd-Rautha. Not someone you'd be eager to run into in a back alley on Gedi Prime, unless you're someone who wanders back alleys in the hope that you'll be raped. Villeneuve uses a lot of visual symbolism. There's a visual couplet in Dune Part 2 intended to communicate a moral equivalency between the Harkonnens and Paul the Ascendant Tyrant. At the start of the movie, a pile of Atreides corpses are torched. At the end, in an almost identical shot, a pile of Harkonnen and Sardaukar bodies are torched. These burning bodies are probably also a visual foreshadowing of the Jihad. In the first movie, the Baron recovers from his near miss with Duke Leto by immersing himself in a black liquid that looks like oil. Oil is one of the spice melange's many symbolic parallels. The Baron is shown submerged in this oily goop in Dune Part 2 as well. Submerging his immense mass in oil, which is a visual metaphor for the spice, is meant to symbolize the Baron's unquenchable thirst for wealth and power. Early in Dune Part 2, Paul sees a vision of a woman walking through a desiccated landscape surrounded by dying victims of the jihad. We learn a little later that this woman is Jessica. Jessica is positioned in the frame so that it looks like she is leading Paul. The symbolic meaning here is very important. Jessica is leading Paul toward the jihad. Hashtag women ruin everything. In the movie, she conspires to have Paul drink the water of life, and in doing so, become the Kwisatz Haderach. She also encourages him to play the part of the Mahdi, so her and Paul's political power will be assured. Jessica's portrayal in Dune is perfect. She is a very power-hungry, calculating individual in the book, and is portrayed as such in the movie. In the book, she takes the water of life and becomes the Reverend Mother of the Fremen, specifically to consolidate her and Paul's political power within the Fremen, and she does so knowing it will damage her unborn daughter. She is an utterly ruthless politician. As the Emperor is landing a spaceship on Arrakis, the bottom half of the ship turns the color of fire as it's heated up by the atmosphere. This is a visual foreshadowing of the jihad. The ship itself serves as a visual metaphor of Arrakis, whose southern hemisphere is inhabited by the Fremen fundamentalists in the movie. The burning southern hemisphere symbolizes the holy war that is about to rage. There is a very famous line in Dune.
Without change, something sleeps inside us and seldom awakens. The sleeper must awaken.
This line isn't spoken in the movies, but there is a scene in which fetus Alia and Jessica both awaken after Jessica imbibes the water of life. Villeneuve presents a close-up of the eyes of both Jessica and Alia, emphasizing that they are awakening. This is almost certainly a visual reference to the famous line from the book, not only because people are literally awakening, but because their awakening matches the meaning of the quote. Without change, something sleeps inside us and seldom awakens. Jessica's Reverend Mother potential was sleeping inside her and has awakened. Alia, the person, and the force of nature she will become both slept inside Jessica, and following the change rendered by the water of life, both have awakened. There's a lot more visual depth and symbolism to the movie, which I won't get into because it would take too long. I would like to do a video analysing Villeneuve's Dune visuals in full, but let's be honest, this video is going to bomb harder than an Atreides nuke against a shield wall, and a full analysis of Dune's visuals would bomb so hard that even Shai Hulud himself would not be safe from the flames. I'm highlighting just some of Dune's visual depth to demonstrate Villeneuve's clear understanding of the source material and how he has infused his movies with the themes and symbology of the books. I also want to combat the idiotic idea that seems to have become an accepted fact in the conversation around this movie, that Dune looks amazing but doesn't have that much substance. It lacks heart. It's a great spectacle, but not a great movie. This is horse shit. Dune Part 2 is excellent, not just aesthetically, but thematically and narratively excellent, and the visuals do not stand apart from the narrative and thematic excellence of the movie. They are at the heart of it. The visuals in Dune are so staggeringly brilliant that it's easy to take for granted Villeneuve's casting and actor direction. Everyone in the cast fit their role physically. They look amazing and perform superbly. Dune Part 2 is a lightning in a bottle moment in terms of acting, a rare production when every actor involved gives an A-grade performance and no one is phoning it in or showing up for a paycheck. Austin Butler absolutely pulsates charisma as Feyd-Rautha. He was Herculean as Elvis, and after this performance, he is easily one of the hottest actors in the world right now. Stellan Skarsgård was the perfect choice for Baron Harkonnen. He oozes moral corruption. The only problem is that there wasn't more of him. Timothée Chalamet had a particularly difficult task. He had to depict both the more compassionate and humble Paul that we see at the start of the movie and the power-mad tyrant that Paul becomes by the end. He is convincing as both, and he was very believable as the great tyrant that unleashes the jihad. Chalamet's performance captures Paul's internal struggle against his terrible purpose, his moral collapse over the course of the movie, and his final defeat as he is subsumed by his desire for power and gives in to the inevitability of the jihad. My favorite Paul moment in the movie is when Stilgar asks, "What are your orders?" and Paul replies, "Lead them to paradise." He gives this order not with the triumphalist tone of a conqueror, but the resignation of a man defeated, a leader who has finally accepted that he cannot stop the jihad that will be carried out in his name. Timothée Chalamet's delivery of this line is absolutely perfect. Chalamet's delivery of Paul's speech as the awakened Kwisatz Haderach was a tour de force and is already rightly regarded as a career highlight. Chalamet also does well with the fight choreography. For his fight with Feyd-Rautha, both he and Austin Butler trained in Kali, a Filipino knife-fighting martial art. They practiced for several months leading up to the shoot, and their on-screen duel was riveting. Rebecca Ferguson has the second biggest role in the movie as Lady Jessica, and I can't imagine a different actress giving a better performance. She must communicate the vast range of emotions that Jessica experiences over the course of the story: worry, anger, love, aggression, compassion, cynicism, political calculation, mysticism, power, command, and many more. And at no point in the movie did I feel like I was watching a performance. I felt like I was watching Jessica. Ferguson nailed every scene she was in, and it was beautiful to watch. Perhaps my favourite performance was that of Javier Bardem. He plays a man of absolute religious conviction who is completely seduced by the power of prophecy. Stilgar is the physical manifestation of Fremen fanaticism and their belief in the Lisan al-Gaib, the messiah that will lead them to greatness. In the final scene, the Fremen warriors rush onto the ships to begin the jihad. The look on Javier Bardem's face in that shot captures perfectly the unbridled passion of the true fanatic. In this shot, Stilgar is the face of the coming jihad. All great movies have incredible standout moments. This is what separates them from movies which are merely good, and the Fremen rushing onto the ship led by Stilgar, utterly entranced by the power of Muad'Dib, is one such moment. Javier Bardem is also the only comic relief in the movie. The few moments of levity all come from him, and the relative humorlessness of the movie is not a criticism. This is in keeping with Dune lore. Life on Arrakis is utterly brutal, and there is little room for humour. Contrary to myth, Dune is not an entirely humourless book. Alia is absolutely hilarious. The scene with her in the Emperor's throne room is laugh out loud funny, and there are a few moments of levity throughout the novel. Hans Zimmer's score for Dune Part 2 is brilliant. Easily his best since Interstellar in 2014, and his only really great work since Interstellar. This isn't a point I would invoke despotic infallibility on, but it does seem that my boy Hans has been phoning it in a bit over the past decade, and if anecdote is to be believed, many of his recent scores have been rushed because he's more interested in touring than composing. This is not the case with Dune Part 2. Hans Zimmer has created some truly beautiful music for this movie. I have listened to the OST many times while writing this script, and my personal favourites are Beginnings Are Such Delicate Times, A Quiet Time Between the Storms, Harkonnen Arena, and Kiss the Ring. All excellent. And Hans Zimmer went all out for this movie. He wrote 1.5 hours of music for Denis Villeneuve to listen to and get inspired by while he was writing the script, then rewrote that music for the movie. Dune Part 2 will probably end up the best film score of 2024. Regarding Dune Part 2's negative aspects as a movie, separate from any judgment of it as an adaptation of the book, the movie's biggest problem is that it just needs to be longer. In particular, we need more Harkonnen. To give an example I haven't mentioned already, I would have liked to see Feyd-Rautha's Gom Jabbar test in full. I know this isn't in the book, but it works well in the movie. Lady Fenring relates after the test that he enjoys pain. If we could have seen Feyd-Rautha in a sadomasochistic ecstasy as his hand is tortured in the Gom Jabbar test, this would have added to his characterization and emphasized his role as a dark inversion of Paul, a second Proto-Kwisatz Haderach.
May thy knife chip and shatter. May thy knife chip and shatter.
Who will face off against Paul in a duel for control of Arrakis. And Austin Butler also would have chewed up a scene in which he gets to experience psychosexual pleasure pain while getting hard at the thought of what he's about to do to Lea Seydoux. Oh shit, it's happening again. My mind is conjuring visions. I can't control it. My flesh engulfed in ecstasy while interwoven in awkward and occasionally painful positions with the immaculate form of Lea Seydoux. Outside of pacing issues, there are no problems with Dune Part 2 as a standalone movie. It is tempting to play the part of the uniquely enlightened wise man of film, to take a contrarian position to the consensus among both critics and audiences that Dune Part 2 is an incredible work of cinema, but there is simply no justification for that. Plainly stated, Dune Part 2 is fucking brilliant. It is a sequel which vastly exceeds its predecessor because Villeneuve learned from the mistakes of Dune Part 1, which is still a very good movie, albeit one with major flaws. There were 3 major problems in Dune Part 1: pacing, not enough movie, and
Dr. Liet Kynes.
Certain scenes and events happen way too fast. The Sardaukar attack on Kynes CH is a good example. There's nowhere near enough movie. As an audiobook, Dune is 21 hours long. Dune Part 1 packs almost 13 hours of that into 2 hours and 35 minutes, even with major omissions such as the total absence of the Guild, the massively reduced presence of Baron Harkonnen, Thufir Hawat, and the shriveling of Kynes into an pizza character played by a nothing burger actress, and the dwindling of Piter de Vries to little more than a memorable extra. Dune Part 1 still feels rushed. It needs another 20 minutes at least, which should be dedicated to more action and more scenes with Baron Harkonnen and Piter de Vries. The third major problem in Dune Part 1 is what they did to my boy Kynes.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Kynes is a brilliant, formidable ecologist and leader who inspired terror and has gone full native. Very importantly, he is the father of Chani. This is an essential aspect of the story because Chani and Paul bond over the fact that their fathers are murdered by the Harkonnens, and both are driven to destroy the Harkonnens by, among many other motivations, the desire for revenge. Robbing Chani of her revenge motive was a massive blow to Chani's characterization and story arc. Kynes was turned from an intimidating leader of the Fremen into a tour guide who was about as intimidating as a 400-meter race against Baron Harkonnen. I would feel more intimidated by the prospect of a hot dog eating contest against Zendaya than I would by a duel with Not Kynes. And not that it really matters, but the actress who played Not Kynes was shit. Dune Part 2 is 8.5 hours of book rendered into 2 hours and 35 minutes of film. Still not ideal given how dense Dune is, but much better than Part 1. In order to adapt Dune fully, doing full justice to all major aspects of the book, it needs to be a TV show. Yes, I know there's a sci-fi miniseries, and no, it is not the best adaptation of Dune out there. It's a very well-meaning production, and its heart is in the right place, but and why is Paul played by a 32-year-old man who looks like a 32-year-old man?
Every day I have to eat responsibility for breakfast and duty for dinner.
I mean a real TV show, a Game of Thrones style show, but realistically that's never happening. Dune has been adapted 3 times now, and Warner have already started expanding the Duneverse. They're currently making a TV show for Max called Dune Sisterhood, about the origins of the Bene Gesserit, taking place 10,000 years before the events of Dune, and Villeneuve is currently working on a 3rd movie to complete the Dune trilogy. And I approve. I don't want Dune to make the same mistakes Star Wars did, retreading the same ground again and again, rehashing the same characters again and again and again, remaking the same stories again and again, until everyone just stops caring. I want Dune to be a great franchise and tell stories that haven't been told before. Whatever your opinion of Villeneuve's Dune, a point we can surely all agree on is that it is very encouraging to see a movie that is genuinely dense and complex succeed. A movie made for adults, which does not insult the audience's intelligence. Audiences have seen enough of hero in spandex saves the world and got bored of it. They have seen magical space wizard destroys bad guy ship with laser sword, briefly laughed and unsubscribed from Disney+. They have seen girl boss beats up bad man many times now, and it is very boring. They have not seen a rock wall annihilated by an ancient nuke, opening the way to a frontal attack by giant desert worm mounted Fremen against an army of elite Sardaukar. That is something audiences needed to see, even if they didn't know they needed to see it. Audiences don't need superhero movie number 836,585,037. They don't need reboot number 17,365. They don't need unasked for prequel spin-off 9,326. They do need Dune.